Thanks, Ben. Well, that's a hard act to follow because it's clearly shows the human face of what's going on in many parts of the world. I'm not an impact assessment expert. I'm a geographer by training and really focus on impacts and vulnerability of climate change. So I'll be focusing a bit on some research and recent workshop that we organized in conjunction with Harvard and Sciences Po, which is in France, on the adaptation, well, essentially displacement and resettlement from adaptation projects, which is broadly construed, and I'll just define my terms a little bit better as I move along, but broadly construed as any government organized effort to move people from one location or to another, either because of a large-scale project or because of direct impacts from climate change. I'm going to begin by setting the stage a bit and then look at what we've learned from past resettlement research, and then go on to the recommendations from this recent workshop we held at the Bellagio Conference Center in Italy at the beginning of this month. So setting the stage a bit, my co-organizers and myself have been involved in a number of different activities. Marcia Castro was one of the co-organizers, and we produced a paper a little over a year ago at the IHTP open meeting looking at displacement from environmentally significant infrastructure projects, which covered anything from transportation projects to dams to you name it, and began sort of exploring this issue. Subsequently, we had the opportunity at Season, where I work at Columbia University, to work with CARE and the United Nations University on a report called In Search of Shelter, which looks at basic climate migration issues and explores a range of scenarios under which people might be forced to leave where they live, and tries to do it in a non-alarmist way, but also through case study research that was conducted by the EACH4 project, an EU-funded project on forced migration, and our own mapping efforts at Season. So you'll see a few maps later in my presentation describing some of the likely impacts in different regions. Just to define terms, DFDR stands for Development, Forced Displacement, and Resettlement. It can be short or long-term, but our focus was mostly on permanent involuntary displacement. We did not focus on spontaneous migration, but on organized resettlement. So people may get up and move for a variety of reasons, but we weren't looking at those voluntary movers. We're looking at people who might be part of an organized resettlement process. You guys know the last three terms, so I don't have to go into those. So I sort of started at this looking at the issue partly because there was a lot of discussion within the development community that climate change might be finally our opportunity to get development right. And I began to think, well, there's a lot of reasons why development may not be gotten right, even despite the impetus provided by climate change to do things differently. Doesn't mean that we hopefully won't see more grassroots efforts, but I do believe that there's still going to be a large impetus to essentially develop large-scale infrastructure projects. In some cases, there may be no choices, such as seawalls or large dams, to adapt. We're already seeing in some parts of the world, and I'll get into this more later, mitigation biofuel projects and other things that are displacing people. So there's going to be a lot of the same sort of interventions, either top-down or private sector, that we've seen in the past. And so climate change won't necessarily make the world a better place in all instances. Resettlement is likely to be part of that package, part of the scenario. It's not something that's easy to talk about, certainly politically sensitive, but it's better to start thinking about these issues in advance. And so there's a lot to be learned from what has happened in the past in terms of large-scale dams. That's largely where we drew our experience from, but you could also look at pipelines or large roads, urban infrastructure projects. At Bellagio, we focused on three causes of displacement and resettlement. One was essentially owing to major infrastructure projects that might be in response to climate impacts, so essentially adaptation infrastructure. Another might be large mitigation projects, and a third might be owing to direct climate impacts. Actually, as our discussion progressed, we basically thought that the first two essentially fit into one category of large projects, large infrastructure, and the third direct displacement had slightly different characteristics, and so we handled them slightly differently. So these are examples of the types of adaptation projects that we might see in the future. Seawalls, dikes, freshwater injection facilities to essentially prevent aquifers from becoming saline. Dams, irrigation works, water transfer streams. Most of you may be aware that there's a large infrastructure project that's been in the works since the 1980s in China to move water from the south, where they're water abundant, toward the north, where they're people abundant, and they don't have enough water now. And this is already resulting in major displacements and resettlement, but is undoubtedly going to lead to more. Dams, dikes, levees, and flood control infrastructure all sort of fit into that adaptation. And you can think about a number of flow diagrams that you might have in which you have climate change, you might have sea level rise. Sea level rise gives rise to the need for seawalls in some cases where you might have very dense urban settlements. Then this, this actually may be in part to limit migration, protect tourism, prevent land loss, but it's going to have a bunch of environmental repercussions, and then in turn, these will have impacts on displacement and resettlement. In terms of mitigation projects, we can look at things like hydroelectric, which generally are not put forward as mitigation per se. Well, it depends on the context. There's a lot of reasons for constructing hydroelectric facilities, but mitigation may be increasingly a large focus of those. Large-scale wind farms, biofuel plantations, forest plantations, and injecting, and then you can go to the scale of sort of geoengineering, where you're essentially trying to alter the albedo of large surfaces. And these, in turn, have their own sort of set of repercussions. So if you're, in this case, the dam may be constructed for hydroelectric purposes. You have power generation, irrigation, navigation, and drainage as benefits, but then you have all these environmental impacts, and how do those influence displacement and resettlement? So you have the direct displacement from the dam, and then the sort of ancillary effects from the environmental impacts of that dam. These are the more direct impacts of climate change, and this is from our study, the In Search of Shelter, which we drew on both case study evidence where you see the outline there. These are studies that were conducted by each four. And then we did this sort of combine that with climate model output. So this shows a drying trend in Mexico, anywhere from about 5% up to 25 to 50% up in the northern parts of a long-term secular decline in runoff in that region. You have that by sort of, to compare, you have runoff in the upper quadrant here. You have agricultural, rain-fed agriculture, and then you have cyclones, which is another feature we didn't address quite as much as these sort of short-term catastrophic events or disasters that occur in many regions. Typically, people tend to return to the areas which were impacted, which makes them a little different than the long-term sort of secular trends. Direct impacts could also occur in the form of sea level rise. Here's the Mekong, and you can see sort of two bands of sea level rise. The darker band is a 1 meter rise, and lighter blue is a 2 meter rise. This is a major breadbasket for Vietnam. It's also very populous, a lot of urban centers right along the Mekong River. And you have Ho Chi Minh City in the delta as well. And we can anticipate fairly major displacements out of this area into resettlement zones. And then, of course, the sort of emblematic cases, the small island states of Tuvalu or Kiribati or other countries that are going to lose potentially their sovereignty. Certainly the cultural traditions and other things. I think one of the more moving examples I've heard, apart from what was just shared by Elizabeth, was cases of cultural traditions being lost by settlers on outlying islands of some of these small island chains who are being moved. We're already seeing some resettlement, not always directly in the name of climate adaptation, but in Mongolia, there's been an ecological reinstallation, Inner Mongolia, sorry. So this is Chinese government basically moving people out of desertified areas, sedentarizing pastoralists in urban areas. In the Mekong, they've actually moved communities maybe 1 or 2 kilometers away from the riverbanks. And actually, even that small move can have very significant impacts on their social networks. So this is an important, in terms of the social capital of communities, it's an important consideration. The Zambezi Basin has had voluntary resettlement away from the floodplain. in communities that have been developed sort of upslope from the floodplain. And the Maldives is promoting a moving of people from the outlying islands to the principal islands. And of course, there's also cases in Alaska of native tribes being moved away from the coast into slightly inland.